Edmund, the island.
"Rail ahead!"
A voice called out, pulling Edmund out of his dull dreams and waking him to the sight of 3 seagulls delving in some rotting trout. They flew away upon Edmund stumbling to his feet, leaving a puddle of white shit on the nest. Edmund snatched the closest ale and drank it until his eyes no longer burned from the dawn sky that stood high over the familiar and daunting sea that he had to call home. He stared out across the calm water, spotting the dull rock in the far distance that his ship was swiftly approaching. Braille was no more than an eyesore among the islands that surrounded it, even from where Edmund stood. He could already see the grey shores and spiked rocks that sprawled from the sands. The island was shadowed over by the colossal hill that stood on the western side of it, holding the towering castle that overlooked the sea for miles and took up so much land with the grounds and walls it claimed for Edmund's family. The unclaimed land of the island was nothing short of dreary. It held only small huts for those that lived there, and a few dozen fish markets that made the shores reek with unpleasantness. It was home. Edmund dropped his foot to the ladder, letting the other follow as he began his descent, before realizing the soft and sudden silence of his entire crew at the sight of him. He stopped. He looked down. Each of the men looked up with expressionless faces from the bloody deck, with a grinning Laurel standing at the front of them with crossed arms. There was the sound of a rope, a sort of straining from his left that drew in his slow and steady attention. His eyes moved with caution, catching the view of the thing that made that horrid noise only an arm's length away from where he stood. Eyes stared back at him, blue and dead, without the shine they once had. They were sunken in the face of the young boy from the night before, the one that had been tied to the foot of the mast among Edmund's horrifying crew, who held in laughter when their eyes met. The neck was snapped and restrained by the tight rope that hung from the nest. It swelled the face in a haunting red and horrid purple. The chest, stomach, and legs were swarmed with dozens upon dozens of wounds from blades, each dripping more blood to the shallow pond that formed beneath him. Edmund swallowed before continuing down the wet ladder, scowling at his crew the entire way, ready to curse at them for what they had done. Each of their faces slowly morphed more into dread than pride as he neared closer to them, all but Laurel's. His boots hit the deck with a splash of blood that stained them. He didn't move an inch from it. Instead, he stood strong and furious beneath the body of the mangled boy.
"I gave an order,"
he called out to each of them, watching them bow their heads and scratch their chins to prepare for another long lecture from their captain.
"You've been my crew for over 10 years, and you still can't understand what a fucking order is."
The silence brewed longer, leaving only the sound of the creaking wood and that awful sound of the aching rope above. Respect was something that would always be tricky to get from his crew, but the decision to keep a pirate on board was clearly something the crew were against more than most things. Edmund's lips tightened.
"You should also know that you have to answer your captain when he asks you a question. He was a pirate, a thief,"
Laurel let out, still with a smirk on his face and absolutely no remorse.
"He was no different from the men on that ship who blasted at our crew and tried killing each and every one of us. I did you a favor, Captain. I killed him so you wouldn't make the mistake of teaching these lads that mercy is ever the right choice in battle. It was a weakness I didn't want them to follow after."
His words made Edmund's eyes turn to fire, struck with rage in the presence of being ignored and betrayed.
"If you ever go against my orders again, I'll sail this ship 100 miles from here and throw you to the sea in chains."
Laurel didn't quiver, not even a tiny bit after hearing what Edmund had to say to him. He watched as Edmund strode over to one of the lads that held his bow, yanking it from his hands and one of the arrows that sat in his quiver. He aimed his bow up, drawing back his one arrow and letting it fly into the rope that held the bloody and beaten boy, splitting it to let the body fall down to the deck with a grim splatter.
"We'll be docking soon. I want all of this cleaned up before we do. Not by the deck scrubber, but by any man who caused this mess."
His orders were listened to with thankful obedience. Each member of his crew had gone their separate ways in a hurry, besides the one man that continued to stare him down with a menacing smile. Edmund turned to look down at the lifeless boy, not feeling any sadness for him, but more anger for those that had put those wounds into his body without a second thought. A man hobbled slowly to his side, burping and shaking off the ale they had drank the night before.
"You know I couldn't stop this lot. The boy's fate was decided the moment you pulled him aboard. Better to die at sea instead of at the hands of your father."
Pete coughed, scratching his bald head and looking down at the mess. The thought of his father and the shrinking distance between them and himself made him sigh.
My father is too much of a coward to ever do something like this himself. He'd just give the order.
The two raised their eyes at the sound of the opening door of Edmund's cabin. They looked strictly forward at the girl that strode out in her ripped and ragged clothes with a face of disgust and dismay. Elaine met Edmund's gaze and gave a chilling step back before stumbling away to the lower decks.
"Poor little bird,"
Pete added to the silence.
She's got to be stronger than at least half the men on this voyage for going through the things your boys do to her. They're not my boys.
As always, Edmund had to mercilessly cast those solemn thoughts aside. He turned to look once again at his approaching home, thinking over the many things about it. He wondered if his father was still as much of a daft cunt as he was before leaving. He thought of how his brother may have changed during the months he was out at sea. There was, of course, the final thought that crossed his mind, one that gave him comfort and a valid reason to return to Braille. That special someone was certain to be waiting for him on the docks. He could already feel their eyes looking out at the water he was sailing across.
"Cast the ropes,"
Laurel ordered in his cunning tone, sending the crew scurrying across the deck like mice before throwing the heavy ropes to the nearest dock beside the ship. Edmund had watched on from the upper deck, standing beside the wheel that Pete was carefully turning. Elaine was busy at work. She scrubbed harshly into the wood with thin rags that were stained with red that his crew gave up cleaning. The water in her bucket was dyed in the same color, sitting only a short distance from the body of the butchered boy that was tightly wrapped in a bloody sheet. Seeing the castle up close was no different now than it was when he was a few miles from the shores. It was the same dull and decaying pile of rocks that he loathed to live in, yet one thing among the greystone had stared right back at him, allowing just a hint of a smile. Atop the balcony of his old chambers, Edmund spotted the familiar figure of his young brother that looked down at the docks as they slowly approached. Byron's hand was raised at the sight of Edmund, offering a swift wave from the far distance. Edmund gave one in return, hoping to keep his brother's gaze away from the corpse on the lower deck before they hurried back into the castle. His brother would be 15 now. Edmund remembered the promise he gave of sending a letter across the sea to him on the day he aged. He never did. The sound of wood grinding together was something that never left his memory. Braille's shores were always so difficult to dock. He looked to the faces that met his eyes with silent greetings. He searched through them in a hurry to find that one he desired. As Edmund had guessed, someone stood on the docks eagerly waiting for his return, smiling just at the sight of him. Edmund marched to the edge of the ship to catch a sight of them up close. Ollie was waving softly, greeting Edmund with those familiar, friendly blue eyes that he had missed so much out at sea, along with the blonde hair on his head that fought with the island winds. Not many others were present, just those who worked on the docks and the men that reeled in Edmund's grand ship before tying it off to the wooden posts. Taking that first step on the creaking wood had been his first time on the island since months upon months ago. Nothing was better than before. In fact, the whole place had grown rather more filthy than what he had remembered from his last departure. But Ollie remained themselves. Nothing was off about his kind face that slowly moved away along with feet that carried him. His friend was luring him away from the docks, practically calling him over without using any words. Edmund wanted nothing more than to follow, but the body of an innocent boy still lay on his ship. Before any of his crew had jumped down to the dock behind him, Edmund seized the shovel that sat against one of the nearby fishermen's stalls. He didn't hesitate when throwing it hard into the arms of Laurel, who looked back at him with a growl.
"I want his body beneath the dirt before dusk," he told him. "As for the goods on the ship, I want them sent back west and given back to the fishing villages in full. Do not go against my instructions again."
With his final order of the day given, Edmund hurried away from his ship of aching men along the crooked docks.
He waved a hand to the sour-faced onlookers, who did nothing but grunt in return. Home.
My lord.
A deep voice called him, soon to be revealed as a guard that was accompanied by 2 others.
Lord Grine has requested that you see him as soon as you can. He needs to discuss a matter of great urgency with you.
Edmund sighed at just the mention of his father. Everything about him made Edmund itch and roll his eyes in utter irritation.
A matter of great urgency, he breathed, not at all concerned about what his father had to discuss with him. You said he requested I see him right away? Yes, my lord, the guard responded. Edmund pursed his lips. So it's not an order, which means you can go up those steps and tell my father that I'll come and see him whenever I fucking feel like doing so.
He gave a slight nod and ushered them away before continuing to follow the path to his friend, wanting to answer his summoning much more than his father's. His walk could only grow faster in excitement. He watched Ollie return to his post behind a stall at the very edge of the petite market. Edmund quickly stood at the other side, posing as a customer for a chance to speak with him directly.
You're back much later than you said you'd be,
Ollie said with a smirk as Edmund admired the lined-up arrowheads on the green cloth in front of him. Ollie sold whatever the ugly blacksmith had given him. His stall was lined with poorly crafted steel daggers and blunt axes.
Pirates, sea thieves, and the crew wanting to make stops for quick trips to the beach brothels. There's so many things that keep me from coming back here.
As footsteps approached them, Ollie resumed his stiff position with haste.
We have more arrows like these ones in the back. Perhaps they can tempt you. Very tempting,
Edmund thought, as he watched Ollie slide behind the scratchy curtain. He followed slowly, scouting those around him to be sure nobody had seen him creeping away behind the stall of steel. As he passed through into the shade, he was met with Ollie's lips. They pressed against his own with such a force that he gave back in return, trailing their hands all over each other's bodies that they had both missed so much in the passing months. He threw aside his bow and quiver to the floor, wanting nothing to restrict his wandering arms that indulged in all that they could grasp on the body in front of him. Edmund lifted him with ease, hoisting him onto the stone table behind them and pecking at his neck. Ollie laughed at how excited Edmund was, like a puppy who met another dog to play with.
Hardly the place,
Ollie uttered with a smirk. Edmund bowed his head, now hearing the sounds of clattering metal from the blacksmith who was hard at work in the other room.
No, I suppose it isn't.
It was a failing war to resist the urge of smothering him. His hands twitched at just the thought of what he would do if nobody was near them. He pushed himself away from the table that they lay on, moving his attention to the tiny canvas that sat next to them. He picked it up, admiring the blend of the different colours that made up the grey dunes of Braille's sparse shores.
Is this new?
Edmund asked, without taking his eyes off of it.
They're all new,
Ollie added, walking over to the shelf of different paintings that he had displayed for his return. Edmund gazed over each of them, filled with pride at the incredible work that his lover had created with just mere strokes of paint. There were a dozen, most being of the hills and beaches. Not that there was much else for Ollie to be inspired by when living on an island such as Braille. One in particular called Edmund's attention like a siren in the sea. It was one of the smallest, packed with all the tones of brown and green to make up the deck and sails of a ship. His ship, the merry voyage that he had just climbed down from only moments ago after his long time at sea.
You painted my ship?
He asked with a smile, looking at the detail of the deep green sails with his crest in the centre of them.
I gave it a try. I didn't know how many ropes you need for a sail or what shade of green they were.
Edmund ignored every critique he had against his own work. He could only see perfection that was painted out on that canvas.
I think it's beautiful.
Ollie smirked at the compliment.
Well, you may think it is, but I've got a lot more things to practice before I'll be satisfied with them. Portraits were always my preference. It appears that eyes, noses and hair are less of a challenge than painting something as simple as the sea.
As he tried stepping aside, Edmund held him once again by the neck and looked into his eyes.
You don't need to improve anything.
He began another ritual of kisses and handwork before being playfully pushed away once more.
You need to leave. Your father will be wanting to see you right away.
Edmund scoffed.
I'm aware. Apparently it is an urgent matter that requires my attendance immediately, he joked. Edmund,
Ollie called him, putting a stop to the childish tone he had.
You really need to go and see him.
The seriousness in his voice was a rare thing to hear. Edmund's smile vanished and frowned.
Fine, I'll go see the old fuck.
He was determined to seize one final kiss before he left. It had been such a long time out in the northern seas and away from Ollie's addictive presence.
But I want you tonight.
He retrieved his bow and quiver before reluctantly stepping back out to the other side of the curtain, ready to start his tedious journey up the hill of 1,000 battered stone steps to his father's towering castle. He rejoined the shallow crowd from behind the stall. Nobody had cared enough about their miserable days of work to even give him a second look. He walked through the coughers and mumblers without haste, still loathing the thought of the upcoming talk he would have to sit through, one that would most probably be about something worthless to him. Despite it all, despite the blood on his deck and his return to the smelly rock he walked on, it was good to see Ollie again. Edmund would gladly spend an entire year in the waves if it weren't for that special boy of his, calling temptation far across the water to him. He scurried along the dirty docks and made it to the sharp cobbles that sprung from the sand. It led into the shadow that covered half the island, forming from the formidable hill and his home topping it. It was just plain grey. There were no hanging banners or vines that sprawled from the cracks, just a stack of bricks with thin windows scattered along it. The walk up to it would challenge the legs of even the strongest of men. It was terribly steep and painful from the rocks below that felt like spearheads. Edmund could only pray for any poor army that would ever attempt to start a siege here. Honed rocks nested in a dangerous ring around the outer wall. The only way in without daring to risk cuts and gashes were along the path Edmund marched along, soon to be met by the outer entrance. Luckily, the path was rarely used by any of the common folk. The grand and grim-looking gates were never opened to them for any reason. It almost felt like peace to be left alone for that brief climb up to his family, but he knew for certain that peace would not last long at all. He eyed the 4 men that were posted outside the gates. They wore armor in the colors of the house that matched the fading crests on the black wooden gate they guarded. Each held a single spear and was slumped against the wall until his approaching feet could be heard, instantly straightening their stances once again.
Welcome home, my lord. Your father would like... If one more person on this island tells me that my father wants to speak with me, I swear to the gods I'll throw them from the castle walls.
With a nod of approval, the guards at the other side of the thick gate lifted the heavy latches and slowly drew it open, revealing the disappointing view that awaited him inside. The castle grounds were sickly. The grass was browning and weeds stretched out onto the gravel path that led to the inner gate. The yards of murky sites were at the other end of the walls too, including the dying gardens that once belonged to Lady Saltspear, his father's second wife, once in the forgotten past. He was always reminded of how dull Braille was when he stepped through those gates. The neglect of the hedges that were once trimmed with such precision in his youth had boiled him. The beauty of the grounds now only existed in his decaying memories, along with the faces of the many allies they once had. Edmund ventured forward, greeting the next line of guards who took a moment in identifying him beneath his maddened hair and sea attire, soon letting him pass through finally into the castle. It was twice as cold in the bare halls than it was out in the grounds. They were dimly lit by candles every few steps that hardly tackled the frozen air or taunting darkness. The castle had few servants. It was all the family of 3 needed in a place with rarely any guests or gatherings to care and prepare for. Nothing caught the eye as he continued forward. It was truly barren, lifeless, and definitely not ready for visitors any time in the future ahead. Every hall and room was like this. The only impressive thing about his home was the view from his balcony, the view he was keen to stare from once the prolonged talk with his father came to an end. Hurrying shoes pulled his attention to his right. In front of him stood a young girl with a forced smile and a tray of burnt meat in her arms.
"My lord, welcome home."
"Hello, Nellie,"
he said in a warm voice to his youngest servant.
"Does he want me in his chambers?"
he asked, knowing she would know who he spoke of. She shook her head and pointed to the closed door at the end of the thin hall. He accompanied her on the short walk, grabbing a leg of meat from her tray as she took the lead to open the door for him. He bowed his head to thank her as he stepped inside. The room was simple and plain. It was a wooden table with wooden chairs. It was rarely used and forever cold, like the entirety of the castle, holding a fireplace with logs older than himself sitting inside. Nellie scurried along to place down her tray on the table. She helped the other servant bring the 2 jugs of ale and place them at either side in preparation for the talk ahead. Edmund sat at one end, staring at the door that was soon to reveal his father. He sat in silence for a brief moment, letting his hand peel meat from the bone and be thrown into his mouth, having no need for the help of a knife and fork. The ale was easy work. It vanished down his gullet with ease and was poured into his chalice many times over. The sudden sound of slamming wood came from the door he walked through. It revealed his younger brother with a face of joy to see him once again. Edmund stood to be greeted by a long and tight hug from Byron, allowing him to realize just how much he had grown in the time he spent out at sea.
What happened to this?
Edmund joked as he flicked his brother's hair that was now down to his neck, as well as admiring the subtle strands of stubbled hair that grew from his chin.
I thought you died,
Byron squeaked.
You said you were going to write, and you didn't write at all. I thought a kraken had sunk you, or you'd gotten eaten by a siren.
His thoughts on why Edmund was late were almost laughable. Even Nellie smirked at the words he blurted out.
You've been reading too many sea myths in those books of yours, but I can promise you there's no krakens or sirens out there that are tougher than me and my ship.
Creatures like those were no more than myths, but to tease their existence was the mild amusement Edmund needed to get him through the meeting ahead of him.
Did you hear about the capital?
His brother asked. Edmund couldn't recall any news he had heard.
I'm afraid not. Did they send more threats our way?
Byron shook his head with saddened eyes.
Emmeline Viren died 4 days ago. Father wouldn't let me send a letter.
Edmund's head bowed down for a moment. He knew he had no love for the Virens, but the sliver of respect he held on to was only ever given to that prominent woman. Every time he or his brother grew another year, a letter would soon follow written by her own hand, wishing them another year of happiness and health. Her kindness and attention for his family didn't seem deserved, but tales of her youth and how she favored his grandfather was known throughout the islands. Her letters only further solidified those rumors.
May she find peace in her next life,
she said softly, before urging his brother to take his seat. He didn't take his eyes off his brother as he sat in the center chair of the table. It was nice to have his face fresh in his memory again, as well as his humorous words. With that thought, the room grew even colder as the doors opposite him creaked open, letting in the bitter presence of his father. He remained in the shadow that the one closed drape had offered, hunching over beneath his long, grey cloak. The silhouette of his wild beard and thinning hair was all that could be seen, but the smell of him was quick to reach the table.
Your ship took damage. I could see it from the chambers,
he uttered in a husk yet formidable voice.
Not as much as the ones who inflicted it. We'll have it fixed within days.
His words seemed to have no effect. He could sense the topic of the talk was soon to approach, judging by Byron's excessive fiddling of his fingers.
Those men can take all the time they want to fix your ship. I'm afraid you won't be leaving these shores for some time.
Edmund's face creased in irritation.
And why would that be, father?
He hissed. He got no answer to his question. His father simply sighed and neared closer to the edge of the table with a limp.
We can discuss all of this tomorrow. I've called for a meeting between the islands. Our friends should be docking by dawn.
Fuck, Edmund thought, rolling his eyes just at the idea of those 4 men traveling across the seas as they spoke. The noblemen were each such pricks in Edmund's mind, all but Raffus of Lodorn, whom he had admired fondly, making him the 3rd and final man he respected on the islands alongside his lover and brother. As for the 3 that remained, each were old and grouchy enough to make him feel as if their company was torture. The first was Ivan of Gravus, which was the island to the west that supplied them with the finer clothes that Grian and his sons were wearing, along with the silk sheets sitting in their chambers. Ivan was his father's father-in-law, and also one of the most tedious people to be around, once they began telling their unbearable stories of the past. The second was Torin of Yark. the most northern island and the best source for a grand supply of iron that was buried deep beneath the sparse lands within the shores of it. Torrin was a man to avoid, but also one most had admired for his bravery and sacrifices he gave in the war between the islands 2 decades ago. But Edmund had only hatred in his heart for what that war became, and soon Torrin became the face to blame. Lastly was Garlin of Gronos, the island that offered nothing but a cowardly and horrid person to lead it. That foul man would be unwelcome in Braille if Edmund had any authority to command it, solely for the disgusting acts he indulged in behind closed doors. "But you need to tell him now," Byron muttered, pulling Edmund from his dark thoughts regarding the nobles that were on their way.
Hold your tongue, son,
Grian spat, silencing his youngest for a brief moment.
Tell me what?
Edmund ordered. His father waved his hand in refusal, not offering a single word. Instead of picking at his father's ignorance, Edmund turned to his brother and stared him down, breaking through the fragile loyalty that he had with Grian. "Father's dying," he croaked. All that their father could do in response was scratch at his hair in annoyance at how easily his youngest son had spoken. Edmund pursed his lips and drained his chalice once more.
"This is the truth?"
he asked, without concern. His father scoffed, taking his final steps to reach the light of the sun that beamed through the window, revealing his face from the looming shadow behind him. There was his skin that was so incredibly pale, and eyes that sank deep into the sockets which had drawn Edmund's attention, although he didn't react with any sympathy for the wretched appearance of his sickly father.
"It would seem so,"
Grian announced before coughing into a rag he quickly pulled from his cloak. He pulled it from his mouth and let the red stains of blood be eyed by his 2 sons, proving his poor state.
"Well then,"
Edmund said beneath his breath, realizing that his demise would soon approach and his duties would land on his shoulders in the near future.
"When did the celebrations begin?"
"Edmund!" Byron called across the table in shock.
"Don't you pretend you haven't dreamed of this day, little brother. It's time these islands were given a lord that didn't lock himself up in his castle, not coming out for anything, including his own wife's funeral." "You will not!"
Grian clamoured with a burst of fiery anger and a heavy fist on the table, drawing red to his face beneath his ghostly white cheeks.
"You will not speak of her. I won't allow it, son. Never within these walls."
Byron stood and hurried out of the room at the first sight of conflict, covering his ears tightly as he did. It was always the way of his brother, too timid to ever sit through the times Edmund and his father swapped curses between them. Nellie shortly followed behind him with the other servant, reading the room to see her presence was no longer needed. Now it was only the 2 of them, both staring at each other with nothing but hatred and scorn. Grian was quick to avoid a fight. It was clear he didn't have the energy to endure one. He stood, without taking his eyes off his son, and walked backwards towards the door behind him, offering a few final words to leave Edmund with.
"Let me be clear with you, son,"
he said to him.
"Until my death, no more setting sail to get as far from here as you can. You must remain here if you ever hope to take my place someday."
"No more sailing?" Edmund almost laughed at his attempt at giving orders, knowing his father couldn't possibly stop him from raising the sails of his ship.
"And no more running around with that boy from the docks. No son of mine will be the kind of man who fucks other men. Those rotten acts you do in the dark will stop immediately, or I will send him on the first ship going west, and you will never hear from him again."
Just the mention of Ollie forced him to a sudden stand.
"You just try it, father. Just you dare."
He let himself be the one to storm out of the room. He took the tray of meat with him, along with a jug of ale, heading for his chambers. Tomorrow was going to be fucking awful.